Saludos amigos de Paraterrestre, soy Pablo Sierra y les invito hoy a una entrevista exclusiva con el señor Brent Raynes del estado de Tennessee en los Estados Unidos, quien ha estado investigando el fenómeno OVNI desde 1967. Es autor del libro titulado Visitantes de Ámbitos Ocultos y editor de la revista Percepciones Alternas. Brent Raynes ha viajado extensamente a través de los Estados Unidos y el mundo entrevistando a numerosos testigos e investigadores. Él ha tomado una perspectiva global e históricamente comprensiva en el campo de la ufología moderna. También ha participado en rituales y ceremonias de nativos americanos, obteniendo valiosos conocimientos e información de sus interacciones con estas culturas. El señor Raynes es capaz de hacer comparaciones reveladoras entre las experiencias interrelacionadas y las disciplinas de parapsicología, chamanismo, arquetipos junguianos y ufología. Influenciado por el trabajo del renombrado investigador John Keel, entre otros, el señor Raynes nos arrojará luz sobre el fenómeno OVNI a nivel local de Puerto Rico, como lo que ocurre en los Estados Unidos. A continuación, el inicio de nuestra entrevista y esperamos sea de su agrado.
Good evening, Pablo. Good evening, Brent. I have the pleasure to know Brent as a friend, and he has been a person that have helped me in many matters, even that he doesn't believe or he doesn't understand that he has, but he has made my panorama, my view of things a little bit bigger. Brent is a person with a vast knowledge of the UFO field, and also has a lot of knowledge in other areas of the paranormal. In his magazine, he has interviewed the biggest and the best of ufology in the United States and internationally. And also, in part of this program tonight, we're going to have a little portion where I'm going to talk about a little bit about something that Brent did in the past, not too long ago. That is that he was a contributor for a book that was written by the Edgar Mitchell Foundation that is not yet on the street. They're expecting the book to be out in August of this year. Plus, Brent is about to put another book in the street. The Edgar Mitchell Foundation is for the research of extraterrestrial life and other matters that have to do with spirituality and with some of the paranormal, so-called paranormal things. And Brent had a participation in that book. He wrote part of that book, part of a chapter, as far as I understand. And it's an old dog in this trade. He been like Pablo said before. He been since the '60s, talking to the big guys, Judge Boulay, this one and that one. So, with any other introduction, I want to present my friend Brent Raynes.
Well, thank you, Hector. I appreciate that great introduction, and I thank Pablo also for having me on this program tonight. I got interested in the subject back when I was all of 14. It's been a while, and initially I thought it was a straightforward, mainstream nuts and bolts ufology. And as I got more involved and read authors like John Keel, the New York journalist who wrote the Mothman Prophecies, and Jacques Vallée, and after reading his Passport to Megonier about the similarities between UFO close encounters, the entity elements, he had hundreds of cases documented in that book, and the similarity to the UFO contact and fairy lore, elementals, and Keel followed certainly a very similar train of thought. He investigated cases that like from Long Island to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and had his own observations of strange lights and objects and unusual encounter phenomena with the so-called men in black, and not the kind in the comedy that we see on TV, more of a serious variety. But we found there was a lot of high strangeness that wasn't being addressed by the mainstream. And so my interest in contact cases, religious phenomena, paranormal, and how they may interrelate with the overall big picture of ufology has been one of my big interests. And one of the reasons that I, a while back, have been drawn to free. I'm no longer a member, but I still have a chapter that's coming out that deals with the similarities between UFO encounter cases and entity cases, as well as religious reports like Marian apparitions, like Fatima, Portugal, and so forth. So anyway, that's sort of an overview of where I'm at and what I'm doing there. And I have a book coming out on dealing with John Keel and the huge influence that he had in the UFO field on myself and others, and telling about his investigations and things that I've looked into and others as well, that brings in all these unusual high strangeness dynamics. So anyway, that's.
I want to mention also that Brent has collaborated with Jorge Martin in Puerto Rico. Jorge has articles about Brent in his magazine, and I believe that Brent has had articles about Puerto Rico through Jorge Martin in his magazine. So
yes, back.
That, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say yes. Back in April 2016, and it was because you had gotten us connected too, that I had done an interview with him, and it's in my alternate perceptions at apmagazine.info that we have all these back issues archived, so anybody can review that issue and that interview. But yeah, it was very, very his input into the situation in Puerto Rico, with all his experiences going back to as an investigator since 1975, seems quite extraordinary.
So in that line, Pablo has some questions related to the phenomenon in Puerto Rico. And I want to say before Pablo asks you that what we are doing with this program is an initiative to open the channels of communications between the ufologists in the United States and the ufologists in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a hotspot, has been a hotspot for a long time. And for some reason, I don't know if the Robertson panel maybe had a lot to do with it, I believe. Puerto Rico has been hidden from the ears and the eyes of the United States ufologists. And there's a lot of things happening, even today probably. There's happening something down there. Almost every day they have some type of activity that have to do with USOs, UFOs, etc. And our job over here is to link up the continent with the island and open up the information so we can, for example, pass it maybe to Stephen Bassett and help with the disclosure and help to put pressure on the government to open their files. So with any other things to say, Pablo, would you like to ask?
Yeah, I would like to ask Brent, and a few investigators have come here to Puerto Rico or are interested in the subject matter here in Puerto Rico about the UFOs. But I would like to ask Brent, what attracted you specifically to investigate UFO cases in Puerto Rico?
Well, I'm interested really in taking a global perspective of all countries, and I've had contacts in Australia and that I've been in touch with, and Brazil and Peru, and what's going on. I've known for quite some time that there's been a lot of reported activity in Puerto Rico. Back in the 70s, I remember the prestigious magazine from England, Flying Saucer Review, carried articles, and of course then there's been Jorge Martin's material that's been appearing in a lot of publications in different languages around the world. And I know of one researcher that I interviewed who's in my book, Visitors from Hidden Realms, was a Mark Davenport. He came down in 1995 with a group to investigate the vortexes, he called them. And he said that what these were like portals to other realms, and people were actually seeing these. And you know, ufologist Jorge Martin was telling me that he had even had some photographs of these kind of vortexes or portals, whatever you want to call them, that people had seen, that UFOs had come out of and flew around, and they were, you know, the classic flying saucer, the cylinder type object or spherical objects. And sometimes they would fly off in different directions. Sometimes they would go down into the ocean. And so it sounded like he had described interviewing hundreds of witnesses to all these different kinds of phenomena going on. And like here in the United States, there have been a lot of reports of where the experiences have had some very bewildering paranormal experiences. Common, of course, are the reports of mental telepathy between the beings and the experiencer, but there have also been kind of poltergeist type phenomena, these strange orbs of light that come into their homes and maybe observing people. Just many different odd things, even levitation. And also he mentioned, well, of course, now the place that Hector had his experience has been it's been a very active place, and there's military presence. And I know that this Mr. Davenport, when he was there, there was a chupacabra outbreak. And sometimes there's this strange luminescence, like Hector described, with the eyes being kind of a glowing orange of the beings that he saw back in '73. And some of these are not normal bioluminescence that we know of, like from nature as we understand it. It's almost like something from another world or another dimension or whatever, you know, another reality. It's almost supernatural. Maybe it is, but it's very peculiar characteristics. And we have these things, you know, that have been reported in the United States, been reported worldwide. So we'd like to see more openness and be able to, you know, get past the cultural differences and the language barriers and everything, and everybody be able to exchange information across the borders, because there is definitely a huge amount of activity going on in Puerto Rico, just as it is in many other parts of the world. And really, from what I've been hearing, it's seems more intense than a lot of places. And actually, there's also descriptions of the military involvement or presence, which is quite intriguing.
Yeah, you mentioned previously the chupacabras, you know, event, and also the Hector Jusino incident. How do you knew about Hector Jusino? How do you get in touch with him?
Well, back in December of 2009, I believe it was, somewhere close to that time frame, I was doing a talk in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, at a mutual UFO network gathering that was sponsored by Eddie Middleton, who has since passed away. But I and several others, including Stanton Friedman, were speakers that day. And my presentation was on international UFO close encounter cases, often involving beings. And it was at that time, after I had done my talk, that Hector had, you know, it was question and answer time, and Hector began to tell me and the audience present about his experience back in 1973, seeing the unusual beings that he observed. And so that's how we got acquainted. And, you know, since then we've met several times, and he's even been to my home here in Waynesboro, Tennessee. Okay. And I've interviewed him for the magazine 2 or 3 times.
Okay. Yeah, it was 2008. It was 2008, December 2008. And we have done some videos. He has done some videos, interviews that he had done to me at his house. I want to ask you a question. Why do you think that Puerto Rico is such in a shadow, like in the dark, you know, to the eyes of the continental researchers when there's so many things happening all the time over there. What is your opinion? Why over here is not being looked at?
I don't know, Hector, because honestly, I mean, you do have, I know that Jorge Martin had brought Scott Corrales, who lives up in Pennsylvania, down to Puerto Rico, and he investigated and wrote a book about the chupacabras, I believe sometime back in the late 90s. And it was a very good book, and there were a lot of very, very intriguing, fascinating stories in it. I would have thought it would have been just about as popular as John Keel's Mothman Prophecies. You know, I mean, there was a lot of compelling and frightening stories, people being attacked by the creatures, the, you know, livestock, pets being killed, eaten, apparently by, in the reports by these creatures. And it was, you know, pretty gripping material. So I would have thought that it would have been, you know, more popular, more known. And I remember back in the 70s, Flying Saucer Review carried reports of UFO activity and mutilation type phenomena in Puerto Rico.
Do you think that the UFO cases that you have seen or have read about here are more related to the military or MILABs, things like that?
You know, I don't know. I certainly think that the military would be sets up in different places where there's a lot of activity to observe and document what's occurring. We've had that here in the United States in various areas reported, like Sedona, Arizona, and the Brown Mountains of North Carolina, and San Luis Valley of Colorado. There is certainly, from all the reports, a strong military presence around a lot of these sites, and a lot of them are around military installations. And I know Mark Davenport told me that he suspected that there was genetic engineering going on, that the chupacabra was actually part of some sort of military genetic engineering. Where they were getting their material, you know, is anybody's guess. But I know that Mr. Martin described how there was places where there was one location he mentioned where it was it's in the, let's see, Vieques. Vieques. Okay. He described how he had hundreds of testimonies of people in that area describing what looked like the Greys, and they would come out of the sea and they would go into these lagoons, and they seemed like a peaceful type being. I mean, people would get within 3 or 4 feet, and then they'd take off into the forest, or else leave the lagoon and go into the ocean or whatever. But you know, it just boggled my mind to think that that amount of activity could exist. And he mentioned other sites that were also, you know, very active, including, of course, the site that Mark Davenport and Hector have described. He was Mark was interviewing people when he was down in '95 who had seen these strange creatures that, you know, sound rather similar to what Hector encountered back in '73. And I don't know, it's intriguing to the extreme, and I would think that there would be much more interest, because Puerto Rico is very accessible to us, you know.
Exactly. And if I may interrupt you, one of the things that I don't understand is that we have all the elements of military involvement, and like you mentioned, and I mentioned in my documentary, the one that came out in the Travel Channel a couple of years back, it seems like there have been manipulation with genetics in Puerto Rico. So, I mean, this is big. To my view, is huge that the military is getting involved in this, and for some reason, there's a disconnect. And you know, like you said, in the 70s, 80s, even in the 90s, there was still a connection in between the island and the continent. And then since the 90s up, has been a disconnection where nobody talks about what goes on down in the island. I have tried myself to find documentation of operations, of military operations related to that in the island, and I can find one. I don't know if you have ever tried to find any documentation on any operations down in the island related to these happenings.
The only thing I can add at this moment is that I was in the U.S. Navy back in '74, and my ship went on a Red Seas cruise, and we stopped at Roosevelt Roads to pick up supplies, and then when we came back from the cruise, we stopped at Roosevelt Roads. I didn't actually get to step on the island. It was a very brief stop, so there was no liberty. But I remember when I was overseas during that cruise in '74 that I met a person at a medical hospital who was working in the military, and he was telling me about UFO activity then in Puerto Rico and how he was out on liberty and he happened to notice some people who I believe were in civilian clothes at a site where UFOs had been reported. And it interested him, he said, because he knew who they were, and he knew that they must have been there because of the UFO activity that had been reported, gathering, information. So I thought that was interesting. So I, back then I was kind of putting Puerto Rico on my radar, what's going on here. And as I say, I soon was reading in Flying Saucer Review material about it. And then years later, Scott Corrales, a well-known researcher who deals in a lot of Latin American stories regarding UFOs and entities. And he was writing back in the 90s for our alternate perceptions. And a lot of material was coming out, and then he had the book on the Chupacabra, which was mainly about, Puerto Rico. Now he had, some sightings in Miami, Florida. And I also interviewed a Dr. Virgilio Sanchez Osijo. It's been a while. He's since passed away, but he lived in Miami. But he was investigating chupacabras back I think in the 90s, and he had been down to Chile, where there was sightings of similar things down in Chile in South America, and he had also reported on the events at Puerto Rico. So he was gathering a lot of this material back in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, let me interrupt you here. I don't know if you remember. I think that it was in our friend's house in Thompson Station that I show you the video of the UFO from Aguadilla. Remember that?
Yeah, I discussed it also. I did a little video with Rich Hoffman about it because he was part of a committee with MUFON that had looked into it. Yeah.
Right. So, this video was as powerful as the videos that Elizondo is showing now. And that video became the #1 video for MUFON that year. But still, nobody is looking into the other things that are happening in the island. And I wonder why the ufologists in the States are not looking more into that, because, like, for example, the activity that is going on in Tennessee, for example, is not as heavy as the activity that is going down there. And that's part of the United States. And, that's what I was asking you, if you knew what can be the disconnection. I think that the disconnection might be a cultural communication type of disconnection. Do you agree?
Yeah, this possibly it's the cultural things may play into it, but it's certainly there's been enough material and enough help from people like Mr. Martin there to have communicated and conveyed the staggering scope of the situation there in Puerto Rico. And it's not that hard to get from the United States into Puerto Rico. So you would have thought that by this time that, having started back in the 70s, all this material coming out, that it would have been, there wouldn't be such a disconnect at this point, but I don't know. Ufology has been in turmoil, of course, for some time. Some of your major organizations like APRO and NICAP have, bit the dust, and ideas have kind of evolved and changed. So I don't know where the disconnect came from, but it does need to be addressed. And organizations like MUFON, who are supposed to be international, they're no longer the Midwest UFO network like they started out to be back in the late 60s. They are now International Mutual UFO Network. If they can, they're the only really major group, I guess, out there to investigate UFOs. If they would just, become more proactive in areas of international reach, this would be, Puerto Rico would certainly be, because of its close proximity and all of the activity that's going on, it needs to be really a priority.
I agree with you.
Brent, I would like to ask you about your research around the world. I mean, have you found any connection between the experiences and the UFO cases around the globe? And if there's any connection, have you found anything that you have to say, well, there's a consistent pattern here do you think that every UFO case is different in every place you have visited and investigated, or do you think there's a consistent pattern of some kind?
Well, I think that one of the significant patterns has been the parapsychological material that seems to occur in conjunction. Someone has a close encounter, an entity encounter, and then right afterwards there is this, the person develops, maybe starts having precognitive dreams or something. And I hope you can't hear it, but I have some cats making a noise.
Yeah, I heard something. Yeah.
But
we're having some paranormal activity here.
Just when you try to find an isolated place in the house that with no disturbances.
Well, cats are paranormal creatures too.
Well, yeah, some say that, especially black cats. Yeah, there's a lot of things that I think we could probably find if we were more in better communication. I know, like Brazil, Bob Pratt went down to Brazil. He was an American journalist who went down there, I think, about 14 times and investigated the most extraordinary situations. Like Puerto Rico, I mean, you've got to get it to the United States, and he made that effort. He wrote a book about a lot of his investigations, and he was a skeptic in the beginning. He got a job for the National Enquirer, and I know you think National Enquirer, you don't think about integrity, but they were serious about their UFOs. The people that ran that paper really were quite interested and would go to a lot of trouble and expense and send their reporters like Bob Pratt to the ends of the earth to cover. And one of the most active places he found back in the day was Brazil. He went all over, and he was probably in Puerto Rico too. And now we got a dog barking at the cat.
Oh. That's okay. That's okay. So you were saying about Brazil.
Yeah. There was a lot of activity, extraordinary reports of the beings, landings. There was even a General Ochoa that Bob Pratt got to interview, and a little later, I actually got to meet a granddaughter of his who described having sightings herself that were, and the grandfather, he was a general. He worked for a university, and he became a contactee. He was actually mentally in touch with the beings, and there was this young girl who was a maid at their home, and she had developed this illness where she had bit by this kind of a beetle bug in Brazil that once you're bitten by it, it can cause a swelling around your heart, and people die from it. And he mentally, the story goes, he mentally told the beings that if they wanted his cooperation any further, then they needed to do something for this girl. So he got her out of the hospital. She was only given, I think, a few days to live. He signed her out and took her out into this open area, and there were other people present, and this craft landed, a being got out and had this like a needle that was glowing on the inside with this bluish glow, and injected this something in her arm, and afterwards doctor said she's fine. In fact, this granddaughter told me that she had gone down a few years ago and actually done an interview with this girl. She's now alive, and I think has children of her own who are, I think one or two of them are in the military. And she also did a talk over at MUFON in LA, I think, in California. Her and her father, who is also now a general in the military, although I think he's retirement age now. Time marches on, but very intriguing stories. And there were also some horrific stories about people being hit by beams of light and then later dying from like what sounded like radiation poisoning or something.
I'm sorry. How much time do we have left?
We have approximately 15 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so this point that he's bringing now is the best time for me to ask him a question.
Sure.
About the statistics that were written at the Michel Foundation. Brent, I was reading the statistics of the survey that the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Extraterrestrial Research have done, and it's about to publish in August. And there was something troubling my head. I noticed that it shows that out of 3,000 people that were surveyed, that 10% said that they had an experience that it was not good, which it leaves 90% of people saying that the experience that they had with the extraterrestrials was good. And we will have to take out of that some percentages on saying that it was like neutral or not so good but not so bad, etc., right? This is probably to me because as an investigator and an experiencer myself, I have found out different. I have found out that it's mostly not a good experience. Can you explain these numbers to us, please?
Wow. Well, you know, I think that, first of all, when I was with Free, I kind of objected to extraterrestrial being in the title, because if you're going to conduct a really objective, unbiased research, investigation of a subject, it should be something about visitor experience, something or other. I thought, you know, we don't know exactly. They may, like Keel said, maybe originate from a parallel world or maybe another dimension. It may not be extraterrestrial. We don't know. That just sort of leading. But I think too that, you know, my own personal opinion that there's been kind of this buildup with these statistics being presented to people that are reporting these things, that it may kind of bias the sampling, because the people who have actually had a negative experience are looking at this saying, well, why do I want to report this to them? Kind of like the groups that talk about, if you're a negative RH, you may be one of the star people, you know, and then you get a large number of, you know, people who want to say, oh yeah, I'm one of those people. So to really, it should be as, you know, presented in a way as much as possible, not to perhaps push someone in, you know, into a category like that. So yeah, I agree that I actually know people I think maybe you're one of them, that has felt inclined not to become part of that survey because, you know, it's like, it seems like it's already biased from the get-go. And there's a lot of people out there who have reported negative encounters.
So will you say in the way that it was presented to people, it would influence the outcome of that survey?
Yeah, I think it has. And I'm not saying that there isn't a high percentage of people who feel their experiences were positive. But by the same token, I think that there are also those who have been overlooked, who just felt that they didn't need to report their experiences that were negative because the organization that was doing the survey had already put out a number of times results and expressing also statements that, that this was something that the mainstream ufology had overlooked. And when in fact, how do you know? I mean, you could kind of, like I say, bias your results from presenting anything that suggests an opinion, this is not really something I wanted to delve into.
Do you think that when the book comes out, we have different numbers?
But I know a lot of people myself that, like being with Brett and Sandy so much, and then they, that's one of the things they ask me, because I was with Free, and say, well, they seem kind of biased when it comes to this, and their experience that they had some really negative type experiences too. And so you can't help but think that, hey.
They don't know who Brent is. Can you tell them real quick who Brent is?
What?
Brent. They don't know. People in Puerto Rico and Pablo and Carlos don't know who Brent is. I know who Brent is because we know him. And I read his books and everything. I have talked to him. I actually talked to him today. But let them know who Brent is.
Oh, okay. You said Brent, but it's Brett, B-R-E-T.
I mean, Brett. You are Brett. Brett.
Yeah.
Brett.
That's why
okay.
I was kind of.
All right.
That's why I was kind of thrown. Okay.
Similar. Yeah.
Okay. Brett Oldham. I met him actually initially back at the conference there in Murfreesboro, and then early in 2010, I began to work with him. I met him through Sandy Nichols, who has a group called the Alien Research Group out of Thompson Station, Tennessee. And also he's says he's also an abductee and has had psychic experiences since childhood, as well as contacts. And initially when I was introduced to Brett, he was introduced as a paranormal investigator. We've been interested in all this paranormal stuff since childhood. And it was only later that Sandy told me, oh, by the way, he's also an alien abductee. And so eventually, I worked with him for a number of years, and we went on a lot of paranormal investigations. I considered him extremely trustworthy, but he's now written 2 books about his experiences. He came out of the closet, I guess, a couple of years after we had met. And now he's known quite well. In fact, next week he's going out to California to be on an Ancient Aliens sponsored abductee panel. And he's been on Ancient Aliens previously, and he's just been filmed again. And what's interesting is they've done they hooked up these electrodes to his head, and they've done an EEG by a noted PhD out there who said that when he was recalling memories of his experiences, that it registered in a part of the brain that only recalls real memories. So this is coming out sometime in August on Ancient Aliens, so stay tuned.
That's pretty good proof. Hey, by the way, he wrote, one of the books that he wrote is named Children of the Gray.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That was his first book, Children of the Gray. If you guys have a chance to read it, take a read. And that's one of those ones that that it wasn't a good experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
I have one last
Yeah.
question for Brent because we're running out of time. In your opinion, Brent, do you think that people in the States are more open and willing to talk about their experiences with UFOs nowadays, or do you think that a lot of people do not tell their stories because they're afraid of ridicule or mockery?
Well, there's still that, you know, reluctance for people to come forward, but I think that with all of the things that have come out in recent years and the interest that's been generated by all these documentaries on television and radio, people are a lot more open. I know when I worked in a state prison for years, about 28 and a half years, and in the beginning, I kept a low profile about my interest because it was, you know, not a good thing. But when the X-Files come out and all these other shows, people were coming to me asking me what was the latest, you know, and it kind of surprised me. And before it was over, before I left and retired from the prison, they had a prison newspaper and they wanted me to write a column in it. Even after I retired, I was still submitting stories.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the interest is, you know, has been stirred up, and a lot more people do have an opinion and are open to talking.
And there is less ridicule.
Yeah.
When I was going to do my I called you. I remember that I called you and I asked you, what do you think if I should do this or not? Because I when I did my documentary, I was afraid that I would be ridiculed. And you told me, no, go for it, go for it. Things have changed, and there was no ridicule in the documentary whatsoever. So, you know, I think that things have changed a lot.
Yeah, and that was a good documentary too. It was very good.
Yeah. And we are trying to change that in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is like 30 years back, 30, 40 years back, the way that it was in the States. That's another thing that we can talk some other day if you would like to join us in another interview some other time.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's the reason why I asked Brent that question, because here in Puerto Rico, I mean, our recent experience, we have, I'm not going to mention any names, but recently we contacted someone that have an experience back in the 90s. It was a very important UFO case in 1991, almost 27 years ago. At the first, the person was willing to talk to us about it. And days later, he said, no, I cannot talk to you guys. I cannot grant you the interview because my family is concerned about, you know, the ridicule and all that. And he said, I'm sorry, the interview, I cannot do the interview. And we said, well, that's fine. But that's why I'm asking you that, because here in the island, my sense is that a lot of people are still, you know, find the subject matter, I don't know, a subject, a ridicule, a mockery, and it's kind of difficult to find people that talk openly about cases like that. And that case that I'm talking about, it was very well known in the central part of the island. So yeah, and here I think there's a sense of self-censorship about this matter, and people, you know, we can hear stories of family stories about, you know, I saw something in the sky. I have a cousin of mine that I have an encounter with someone, but it's always go down with, you know, the joke and all that. I mean, it's not being taken seriously, at least publicly here in Puerto Rico, and the media here do not talk about it. I mean, it's always a joke here. So that's why asking you, I mean, the differences between how people treat this matter here and in the States. But that's about the time we have for tonight's interview. I would like to thank again Mr. Brent Raynes for the interview. And I'm going to state again that this interview is going to be in English, but it's going to be translated in Spanish for our Spanish-speaking friends doing voiceovers. So we're going to try to do that for the first time. And this is our first, like I said, this is our first English language interview. I think it went very well. What do you think, Brent?
Yeah, I do. I think we covered a lot of relevant, significant points. And of course, I know we've just touched the tip of the iceberg, but I think it's been very relevant what we have discussed, and I appreciate you having me on to talk with you. And I don't have any answers, but I'm digging.
We're all trying to get the answers. And I'll also like to thank my good friend Hector Jusino. Thank you for your time, my friend.
Thank you for having me tonight again, and thank you, Brent, for giving us this interview. And like I said, I hope that we see you in this channel again. And
all right, Hector, I appreciate
see you around again, and that we get to work some stuff together, because I know that you have a new group, and I am interested in your new group. That's another interview.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Before we finish our program tonight, how can people find your work and know about your, or get in touch with you, Brent? How can people do that?
Okay, well, my online magazine, which is free, it comes out monthly on the 1st of each month, and it's called Alternate Perceptions, and they can Google that, or they can go directly to the site at apmagazine.info, and they could also write to me, Brent Raynes at yahoo.com, if they want to reach to me personally, directly. I'm always interested in hearing from people, researchers, experiencers, and getting their input, whatever it may be, as long as it's constructive, not
Right. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent, Brent. I'm going to put that information down in the description area down below the video. And well, that's all for tonight, friends. I would like to thank him. Also, my good friend Carlos is in the background. He's listening to us. He's silent tonight, but he's listening. I know he's listening.
I see him, yeah.
Yeah, he's with us. Yeah, well, thank you once again. And
okay,
I hope you have a good night, and see you next time. Amigos, muchas gracias por sintonizarnos. Si les gustó el pasado video, le pedimos por favor que se suscriban a nuestro canal Paraterrestre en YouTube, pulsando el botón de suscribirse. Así usted recibirá de primera mano los mejores videos y la mejor información respecto a estos temas de la conciencia, el misterio y otros temas de interés para ustedes. También le pueden dar clic al botón del icono de la campana para que usted reciba notificaciones de nuestros nuevos videos.